Great. Okay, I think we can get started. It's our pleasure to have Michael with us today. Michael Hudson is a professor at Beijing University. And
Peking University in Beijing.
That's right. They kept, I just learned last night, and I forgot it already, that they kept the old name, the historic name Peking in Beijing. The university is Peking. Sorry about that.
Peking University.
Sorry about that, young man. I mean, I want to be sure we get the Chinese symbols just right, and I couldn't read mine. Also, the University of Kansas at
University of Missouri
at Kansas City,
and
and many other places. But one of the really leading monetary theorists and monetary historians in the world, and working with us on a number of projects. Hey, and there's Dr. Jeff Fo. Hey, Jeff, welcome. So Michael had a great turnout at Politics and Prose last night, and kind of turned the audience upside down on banking theory and banking problems. So we're delighted to have him do the same thing here. And my old colleague Jeff Fo just walked in from the Economic Policy Institute. Welcome, Jeff.
Great to be here.
Michael, it's all yours.
well, last night I was a little distracted at the beginning because I'd invited a friend of mine, a German professor from Tübingen, who'd chaired a conference for David Graeber's, the archaeological content of David Graeber's debt book last summer. And David wrote the book largely to popularize my ideas of debt cancellation in the ancient Near East. And he published, I'd done a lot of academic, I'd done 5 volumes of archaeology and Near Eastern economic history for a group that I organized through Harvard beginning in 1994. And the archaeologists have all picked up the history of money, but the economics profession really didn't. I didn't think anyone was going to be interested in this until they read my critique of the modern economy and why the modern economy is being stifled by debt. But obviously his book took off much larger than any of my books have done. So he ended up getting me to his book, his literary agent and the German publishers, and they've actually sold better in Germany than they have in German than they have in the English language field. And one of the interesting things in the conference I went to in Tübingen was I was criticized for talking about the Dark Age after Rome. And he said, there's been the new economic history in the last 10 years that finds it wasn't so dark after all, that we found the rich people were really living really well. They had really nice ceramics. They imported a lot of stuff. Well, the result was by importing everything, largely through Near Eastern traders, Rome didn't have any money. The only money economy that survived in what I still call the Dark Age was at the very top of the 1%. And the rest of the economy had already been turned into debt bond servants. And in order to stop the depopulation, just like you're seeing in debt-strapped countries like Greece and Latvia and Iceland today, you finally gave the debt servants not sexually segregated barracks that they were living in, but you let them have families and you turned them into serfdom. So this transition to serfdom was applauded now as economic growth is the most efficient way to grow, given the assumption that all the economies have to repay their debt. And what made Rome and Western civilization, beginning in classical antiquity, different from the preceding 3,000 years of civilization, the Near East on which I concentrate, is the fact that all of a sudden finance was given priority over property. And people think that the defining character of Western civilization is security of property. But it's not secure at all. What you really have even more secure than property is the security of debt claims and the priority of creditors to foreclose on property and indeed to reduce the objective of getting rich throughout the Bronze Age and classical antiquity was to get labor dependent on debt so that they would have to work off the debt, which they never managed to work off, is the source of labor. And then when they can't still can't pay the debt, you foreclose on the land and you monopolize the land. That's what the biblical prophets were talking about. The question is, how did civilization avoid this for 3,000 years? How did you have stability, rising living standards, and avoid the economic polarization? What you had was debt cancellation. Every ruler of Hammurabi's dynasty canceled the debts of the consumer debts, not the business debts. They were all left intact. Debts among businessmen, because if a businessman got broke and lost the business thing, he still had his citizenship in the community, he still had his self-support land. The reason that Hammurabi and the Sumerian antecedents 500 years before him, and the Neo-Babylonians for the next 1,000 years, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the reason that the rulers all canceled the debts was if you had a wealthy class of creditors foreclosing on land and reducing, taking the labor of the citizens, then this labor would not be available for corvée work, to build the canals, to build the walls, to do all of the public infrastructure that was all built with public labor and supplied to society. And you wouldn't have them available to fight in the army. And so I began by wanting to write a history of debt cancellations, and to do this, we had to have the first conference in 1994 on privatization in the ancient Near East to Rome, and privatization really is what led to the economic polarization. You had you can imagine if a modern economist would go back to ancient Sumer and Babylonia and say, get in a time machine and say, we're going to be the advisors to the king. Here's how you do it. You want to privatize anything. That kind of a society would have been conquered very quickly, or there would have been a flight of population elsewhere, because you had, in ancient society, you couldn't hold, you had huge populations making these gigantic temple pyramids or the Egyptian pyramids. All of this had to be ultimately voluntary, because if it wasn't voluntary, they would have left. So the question is, how did you make this voluntary? Well, they made it by having a constant series of festivals. We've dug up, the archaeologists have dug up the remains around the pyramid. They found that the pyramids were not like Cecil B. DeMille did it. They weren't built by slave labor. They were built by professional craftsman labor. They were very well fed, high meat diet, and a lot of beer parties. Same thing in Mesopotamia. This was their socializing experience. It was a beer party. So it all worked really until Rome conquered the countries, privatized the land, charged enormous usurious rates. There were revolts against the Roman under Mithridates in Asia Minor. 20,000 Romans were killed in one evening, and they all fought back. And that was part of the century of economic war between 133 BC, when the Gracchi brothers were killed by the senators, saying, the Gracchi were supporting the debtors and said, you can't reduce the population of debt or you're going to have a different kind of a society. And they were killed by the Senate, and there was 100 years of civil war. Other creditor leaders like Acilio were killed, Julius Caesar, who sort of had passed a bankruptcy law to free people from debt. So the whole of ancient history, held by historians, is one side, and none of the history gets into the economic curriculum, and it's all cut off from the history of Western civilization. The idea that there's a clash of civilizations today, that Western civilization began in Greece and Rome, this began after a dark age. There was a really bad environmental disaster from about 1200 BC to 750 BC. There was a drought, global cooling, and this put all sorts of populations in motion, moving over. The writing disappeared, the central palace disappeared. We have people, specialists in Mycenaean archaeology, read Linear B, and in Linear B you had the local office manager being called the Basilius, who'd be the local territorial manager. They disappear from the Linear B records. Once they have alphabetic rating, they reappear around 700 BC, 750 BC as the king. So obviously, when central authority fell apart, you had pretty much what you had in Russia under the kleptocrats. The local managers just registered all the land and the means of production in their own name, privatization. So that's sort of the background picture. I don't get that into my book, but what I do get into my book is a recasting of the national statistics for things like we're very much in the argument that occurred over the Bronze Age, the Dark Age, is very much like the argument that's been occurring in the 2016 election that we had. When Hillary Clinton came out and said, look at how much you're better off now than you were when Obama took power. Well, if you look at the statistics between 2008 and 2016, what you have is that all of the growth in the economy from 2008 to 2016 occurred to the top 5% of the economy. For the 95% of the economy shrunk. And so if you look at GDP going up, that somehow doesn't tell you really what's happening to the economy at large. All of this growth was centered basically in Wall Street. And when you subtract the FIRE sector, the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, from the national income accounts, which really is a transfer payment, you find that that's where all the growth has occurred. It's occurred in what the classical economists called unproductive activity, a transfer payment. So when you have Lloyd Blankfein coming out and saying the Goldman Sachs partners are the most productive workers in the economy because they add $22 million a year to GDP, that's what we pay our partners. This is all counted, what they take is their growth. And yet all their growth is siphoned off from the 95%, from what they've got from sticking the mutual funds and the state pension funds with the bad loans for which they had to pay tens of millions of dollars of penalties. All the big banks have had to pay tens of billions of dollars of penalties for the fact that most of these financial products that they sold didn't really add to output at all. They didn't add to living standards. The financial system has become a transfer payment system to suck wealth and income upwards into this financial overgrowth. And I wrote this J for Junk Economics as a companion volume to my Killing the Host, which was all about the relationship between the financial sector as parasites, essentially living off the host. And in nature, a smart parasite is going to steer the host to good food. It's going to keep the host healthy. It's going to realize that it benefits from the host. But a dumb parasite is going to kill the host, and that's pretty much what we're having with the financial sector today. In German, there was a problem in translating. They thought that if I talked about parasites, that everybody would think that's anti-Semitic, and they translated the book as the sector. But it's very because of Germany's history of anti-Semitism. But it's very interesting. I have a different take. If you look at what role finance played in the transition of early capitalism from for state finances from the medieval period down to about the 19th century, there was a reason that the Jews were selected by the princes as the bankers. And that is, if you're a prince, you want to keep authority in your own hand. The last thing you want to do is assign the most important function of government, money creation in the treasury, to one of the other aristocratic families. Because then what are they going to do? They're going to overthrow you, and they're going to have all of the power. So you wanted to keep the financial management out of a position where it would be able to gain control of the economy. And anti-Semitism was the perfect vehicle for how European governments financed themselves, because the Jews could not own land. And you wanted the whole center of early capitalist policy was to separate the financial functions from the landowning functions. And anti-Semitism was the vehicle to prevent this. So they said, okay, we'll let you do the finance, but it's like a nuclear reactor. You have to keep this financial thing separate from the land ownership. That's why the so-called democracy, meaning the oligarchic takeover of the revolt of the barons and the what is that document that they all say that West
Magna Carta.
Yes, yeah, the Magna Carta. It all said, well, we don't have to pay the money we owe the Jews. We get to keep all the money, and by the way, we don't have to pay the taxes to the government either. We get to privatize all of the land rent that was supposed to be used for the first thing that the Norman William the Conqueror did was in 20 years to organize the compiling of a Domesday book to see how much land surplus can be used, and that's going to be, what we're going to use as the royal funding. Basically, the Magna Carta was a Thatcherite privatization of this, taking away and turning over the landowning to the landowners. And the first thing, the way rich people get rich in history is not paying their debts. And that was the other advantage of having the Jews as the financiers. You could screw them, and there wouldn't be, they were not in the position that Goldman Sachs is today to protest when you didn't cancel the debts. Ultimately, they were expelled, and so the ending of anti-Semitism meant that for the first time you ended the separation of the finance between separation of finance from landholding and from the asset and wealth structure of society. Well, needless to say, Germany is not ready for a discussion like that yet. But what I've done in the book, in addition to providing a vocabulary for understanding how the economy works, is I have my basic economic model. And the economic model can trace how the economy has shrunk since 2008 as a result of the financial sector, which has now become symbiotic with the real estate sector. And in the national income accounts, you have finance and real estate together. That for many years they didn't even separate the profits in the two sectors because they were so symbiotic. 80% of bank loans are to real estate mortgages. And what you've had is basically a privatization. It's as if the landowners in the 19th century, who were the wealthiest people in society, sold out their lands and converted their land holdings, by which they controlled society, into financial holdings and essentially became creditors. So the rentiers that in Ricardo's and Malthus's time in the early 19th century were the richest people, now became basically the financial sector, the banking sector, interwoven with the rest of the economy. So I find out, take the concept of disposable personal income. In the national income accounts, they describe disposable personal income as what the wage earner gets after the taxes are taken off the top. As if somehow all of the, and let's say there you have 15% FICA withholding for Social Security and health care. You have another maybe 15 to 20% taken off for federal, state, and local income taxes. So, that leaves maybe 70%, 66% that they say is disposable. But when you look at what else comes off the top, you realize that this residue is not all that's disposable. The most expensive item in the wage earner's budget now is housing. And in order to get a mortgage, you have to go to a bank, and the banks will not give this mortgage unless it's guaranteed by the Federal Housing Authority and by the government. So the government basically defines the housing market, and they will guarantee any mortgage that absorbs up to 43% of the mortgagee's income. Now just imagine, here's 43% that is either paid for rent, especially in cities like New York, or is paid for the mortgage. So when you take that 43%, or let's say it's 40% off the 70%, that leaves only 30% available. But the average wage earners, and that's why I want to involve the Bureau of Labor Statistics to see what's spent on. They spend their money on credit card debt, student loan debt, and other bank loans, automobile debt, and that absorbs another 10% of the paycheck. So you're getting money that's off the top. To make a long story short, when you go through the model that I explain in the book, you realize that only between a quarter and a third of the average paycheck in America is actually disposable on goods and services. So this is, when you look at the economy in terms of the circular flow, you find out that there is a large drain from the circular flow, and the drain is not only to the government, but to the financial sector, and most of the drain of the government is also to pay the financial insurance and real estate sector. So I'm trying to segregate the fire sector from the real economy so that when people talk about what's really growing, it's really this overhead. There's a difference between wealth and overhead. And what people think in terms of wealth, in terms of the stocks they have, the bonds they think of it in terms of financial claims. And yet these financial claims were described in the 19th century across the political spectrum. From Karl Marx to right-wingers like Henry George, they used the word fictitious capital, or fictive capital. And in the 1920s, you actually did have a Nobel Prize winner talking about this. But he wasn't a Nobel Prize winner in economics, he was a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Frederick Soddy, who claimed the term virtual wealth claims on wealth as opposed to tangible wealth and a means of production. None of this really is fed into the economics curriculum. In all the time that I studied through the PhD in economics, nobody took a course in accounting. They don't think in terms of balance sheet. And if you think in terms of balance sheet, you realize that to every asset there's a liability. And people think of themselves as owning their houses, and that is their asset. But in America, for the first time around 2007, the average overall equity for overall American real estate fell below 50%. Most of the value of the house was 52% already in 2007 was the mortgage. So people think that they actually own the property, but they actually, the owners are the banks. And the idea is that the banks will lend to commercial investors in exchange for who will take out the biggest bank loan. And basically, a house or a commercial office building is worth whatever a bank is going to lend against it. And banks are willing to lend to bidders. People will bid up to the point where the winning bidder is willing to pay the bank all of the net rental income to the bank is the mortgage. And why are they willing to do this? They're willing to do this because the real estate people are not into making a profit. And if you look at in the national income accounts for the fire sector, you realize that real estate hasn't made a profit since 1945. Since the end of World War II, it's a nonprofit sector. It's as if it's run as a charitable foundation. And the name of the game is capital gains. They're willing to pay the bank all of the value, the rental value, and homeowners are willing to pay the bank the entire rental value that they would otherwise have to pay someone to rent a house in exchange to buy a house. And they were willing to do this from 1945 to 2008 because they always said, well, the house is going to become more valuable. We're going to make our savings by capital gains. So the commercial sector developed what it called the theory of total return. Total return is current income plus capital gains. And in the real estate sector, the total income is zero. In the financial sector, it's very often zero because their accountants don't have any profits. You have the whole idea of running an economy is not to have any profits because they're taxable. So it's basically, if you want to track how wealth is accumulated, you don't track it by the accumulation of profits. You track it by total returns. You should add to the national income statements the profit plus the capital gain, and then you have an idea. That's how you explain economic polarization. Well, needless to say, this is not what Mr. Piketty did in his book on why the economy is polarizing. It's not what George Soros's INET has done. The key to all of this is to keep it undocumented. If you don't report that most of the growth in wealth takes the form of land value gains, stock market gains, and the huge bond market boom that you've had since interest rates were driven down, basically to subsidize the banks, then if people don't measure it, you're not going to tax it, and you're not going to regulate it. So the first thing I think we have to do to describe why there needs to be a change in the economy and why the economy cannot continue along the current track without collapsing is to document how wealth is actually being increased, and it's by the 1% gets the 99% into debt. That's the big picture. And it's possible to calculate all this. The Federal Reserve does not make it easy to do, because the Federal Reserve is subject to the real estate lobby that says, no, all of the gain is really the value of the buildings being inflated, and we need to keep the buildings. But the Federal Reserve figures treat land value as a residual. And if you looked at the nonsense of this approach, which is dictated by the real estate lobby, is which also doesn't want to have to pay taxes on the land, is in 1994, if you took the value of all the land owned by every corporation in the country, all the corporate-owned land, what do you think that might have been worth? Under the Federal Reserve, it was worth a negative $4 billion. In other words, we have a deal. We're going to give you all the land that every corporation owns, but there's a kicker for all of this. It's a negative value. And this is the kind of nonsense. The job of statistics today is not to describe how the economy works. It's how to describe how an economy would work if the wealthiest 10% didn't have to pay income tax and actually contributed to the economy instead of draining it for their own benefit and shrinking the economy. So you have a kind of inside-out statistics. I couldn't find any university in America that would teach national income accounting. I did try to teach a course in this in 1971 at the New School graduate faculty in New York, and I used Marx's theories of surplus value as a history of economic theory to show the different concepts of national income and the great debates between Ricardo and Malthus and Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. Howard Brunner got furious, and he said, "That's not our idea of Marxism. You're a Trotskyist." So I decided to leave academia and go to work for for Herman Kahn at the Hudson Institute, and stop being an economist and call myself a futurist, which got me free from all of this statement of what you say you do to become an economist. So basically, I realized that in order to justify this false picture of the economy, you needed to realize that most of the economic terminology is euphemism. For instance, Alan Greenspan and Paul Krugman called the whole run-up to 2008 the Great Moderation. Now just imagine, here you're having what the FBI called the greatest wave of financial fraud in American history in 2004. They came out with that, and they said it was all financial fraud. So what did President Bush do? He immediately removed all of the white-collar crime agencies from the operatives from the FBI and put them to work on Homeland Security and things like the foreign threat. If you're going to rip off society and impoverish it, you have to blame the foreigners. So, of course, you don't want to say it's the banks that cause it. You don't want to say it's the rentiers that cause it. You want to blame the foreigners, and that's basically what Bush did. So the fraud accelerated under Alan Greenspan, and what what made it moderate? Well, Greenspan went before the Senate committee, and he said, what has made it so moderate is we've had a great growth in productivity, but we haven't had wages go up. And he said, why? And that it's what his biographer called the traumatized worker syndrome. Workers are afraid to go on strike, and they're afraid to complain even about working conditions because they're one paycheck away from missing a mortgage payment or a utility payment. And if you miss a mortgage payment or a utility payment, then your credit card rates all of a sudden go up to 29% because you've been declassified. And if you miss a mortgage payment, you're in danger of having the house foreclosed, even through fraudulent foreclosure, losing the whole, becoming homeless. And Alan Greenspan said, the American worker, thank God, is so deeply in debt that they can't afford to go on strike. They can't afford. We are now in a wonderfully stable society. This is, what we really need. This was the golden mean for him because there was no complaint. It was the great moderation. And of course, we saw what happened in 2008. It was a trend that couldn't go on. And this is what Marx wrote, Volume 3 of Capital about. When I was young, I must say, I grew up in a Marxist environment. When I was like 7 or 8 years old, we'd go to friends' houses, and I'd always recognize the 3 volumes that I could always recognize, the red volumes, Charles H. Kerr Company. And I'd always look at them. Nobody had ever read them. And they'd all had them on the shelf. They were all unopened. And there used to be Strand used to have so many copies of these by the time I came to New York in the 1960s. They had a whole storeroom full of the Kerr edition. And the Marxists that did read Marx didn't really get beyond Volume 1. And certainly this was a result of Stalinism for many years. It was all about worker-employment relations. And that's what Marx really wrote about. The relations, the labor theory of value, there was a difference between what the labor was paid and what the employer sold the products of labor for, and that was the markup of profit. And Marx thought, well, the one good thing that capitalism does is it leads to socialism. That the historical tax of capitalism task is to get rid of the rentier sector. It's to do what the 1848 revolutions were supposed to do. They were supposed to overthrow the landlords, nationalize the land, or at least tax it, and bringing banking out of the usury period into. They were supposed to industrialize banking, which seemed to be happening in Germany at its time, when you would have the German banks, unlike the English banks and other English-speaking countries. The German banks would not only lend money to heavy industry, but they would become stockholders and have a stock ownership in the companies that they lent to. And they pressed the companies not to pay out their revenue and dividends, but to reinvest it. So that by the time World War I broke out, and I went into this in The Killing the Host, there were arguments in the British journals worrying that somehow the Axis might win the war because they had superior banking, because the English banking was short-term, pay out the dividends. The investment banking and the stockbrokers were hit and miss. They'd float a company and then lose interest in it. And it was all hit and run, as opposed to the German triangular relationship between heavy industry, the government, and military spending, which is what financed basically the German steel industry and the other heavy industry there. So World War I derailed the whole direction in which history was going. It derailed this industrialization of banking. It turned the controlling heights of the economy back to the finance and real estate sector, basically, just the opposite of what was expected. And it led to exactly the opposite of how industrial companies were getting rich. The first professor of economics in America at the first business school, the Wharton School of Business, was Simon Patten. And Simon Patten was a protectionist, a spokesman for the industrial class. He said, the function of public infrastructure is a fourth factor of production, alongside land, labor, and capital. But the role of the government infrastructure is not to make a profit. Instead, the productivity of infrastructure is defined by how much it lowers the cost of production for society by providing roads, public utilities, electricity, transportation, and other water, other sewer, other basic needs freely, or at least at a subsidized rate. And that's how America made itself the leading industrial competitor leading up to World War I and thereafter, by public enterprise that was the exact opposite of Thatcherization. And up through TVA and the 1930s, you had the idea of providing bank services at cost, and the idea at that time was that banking was supposed to be a part of the public sector, and the idea of banking was to provide credit where it would be used productively rather than for speculative terms, and rather than adding to the debt overhead of society, it would do what German and Central European banking had done and fund capital investment to increase productivity, not merely to strip income for current financial gains. There was a whole different idea of the role of finance in the economy. The role of real estate in the economy was to be essentially, that was to be, you were to keep down the price of housing by taxing the increasing value of land that was created by public infrastructure spending on roads, utilities, sewers, public schools, parks, museums, to capture all of this public spending back for the public sector and to have a circular flow so that the rest of the economy, the private sector, could operate effectively. Well, under Thatcherism and the privatization, you have the exact opposite of all this. And I'm worried that that's going to be the idea of infrastructure spending under President Trump. That if you have the kind of public-private partnership that you have under Thatcher, you're going to add the cost of acquisition, you're going to add interest charges, you're going to add management charges. You'll run the economy in the way that the Mormon presidential candidate, I'm blocking his name, Romney, essentially ran his companies. You strip them all off as expenses. Borrowing from a bank that's preferably abroad in the Cayman Islands or somewhere else, so that you take all your profits in a country that doesn't have profits. By the way, everything I learned about offshore banking centers and money laundering, I learned from the treasurer of Standard Oil when I did a study of the balance of payments of the oil industry. In 1965, I was Chase Manhattan's balance of payments economist, and I went to him and I said, I can't figure it out. Where do you make the profits? Do you make it at the producing end, where you dig up the oil, or do you make it at the consuming end, the refineries or the selling? He said, we make them right here in my office. And I said, I don't get it. He said, well, if you look at the balance of payment statistics, there's something, there's America, Asia, Africa, and there's also something called international. I thought, well, they're all international. He said, well, what international means is that's countries that aren't really countries, but they're Panama, they're Liberia, they're countries that use the American dollar as the currency, so there's no currency risk, and they also don't have a income tax, and that's where we register all of our vessels. It's called flags of convenience. And so Standard Oil would buy its oil very inexpensively from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and other countries. They would sell it very inexpensively to their affiliate in Liberia or Panama. They would sell it at such a high price to their refineries in Europe and the United States that there was no taxable income. So the overall enterprise didn't have to pay any tax at all. And he walked me through all of this, and That's, by the way, why they're not really going to clamp down on money laundering and the offshore banking centers. In order to clamp down on the crooks and the money launderers, you'd have to clamp down on the oil industry and the mining industry. And there's a reason why Exxon's chief is the Secretary of State. You're not going to have that kind of clampdown happening because that's what makes extractive wealth untaxed. And the interesting thing is the idea of all of the forecasters of where capitalism is going in the 19th century, everywhere from Marx on the left to right-wingers, they all thought that the idea was that you're going to tax unearned income. And the whole basic of classical economics was the distinction between earned and unearned income, between profits and rent extraction. And they thought you want to tax away the free lunch, the rent of natural resources, and you don't want to have to tax industry, you don't want to have to tax labor. This was the whole idea of socialism in every country of the world and of capitalism. It was what the business schools taught, was how to make a company competitive. What you have today is exactly the opposite. And you can show it statistically. You can show that almost all of the growth in not the industrial sector. The industrial sector is itself being financialized and essentially looted by paying out if you're a corporate manager and you're paid by how you increase the stock value. Lescanic at Harvard has shown that 92% of the Fortune 500 companies, 92% of their cash flow has been used for stock repurchases or to pay out dividends to increase the stock price. Only 8% has been reinvested in capital expansion. And yet, if you the myth in the textbooks is that banks lend money to help corporations build more factories, and you have pictures of the happy worker carrying a lunch pail in the factory getting money from the bank to lend. Banks only don't lend a penny for corporate expansion. That's what the stock market's supposed to do. Banks lend money for corporate takeovers, and they lend money for dividend payouts. They don't make expansion. They go blue sky thinking. And if you've met the bankers, and I worked for banks, in my formative 20s, that's how they think. And so the picture you get in the textbooks is completely different from what you get in banking, which is why I only got a C+ in my money in banking course. No. And the reason was, as Paul Samuelson explained in his textbook, and as another Nobel Prize winner, Bill Vickery, explained in his textbook, economics, the criterion of excellence in economics is internal consistency of the assumptions. It's not reality. It's whether the assumptions you make is internally consistent, and it's like how you grade a movie. Is there a fault in this plot? Is the novel believable to the characters? Are they internally consistent? Or you know how annoying it is to go away from a movie and say, wait a minute, here's what would have happened. That wasn't really consistent. Why aren't people doing that for economics? Why aren't they the graduates? I most imagine that the graduates felt that way. Wait a minute, that's not how the world works. We work for companies, or we work for banks. I was teaching in New York, where a lot of people did work on Wall Street, or for the United Nations for trade theories, and they usually drop out of economics at the MA level. They don't want to go on to get a PhD and make this parallel universe theory. And so I wrote the J is for junk economics to sort of show that there is a way of looking at the economy that's not a parallel universe. You can look at the economy, and the way it really works, I wanted to call it reality economics. But there was nowhere where I could fit this into the economics curriculum, which is why I'm not actually teaching. I do have academic professorships all over the world, but I don't have to go there teaching all the time. I go there for special conferences to try to get the government to recast statistics along a more reality-based thing, and that's why I'm here with Joe and with Gar, trying to put together how can we make a map of how the economy works. How can we show that it's getting that it can't continue this way. My motto is debts that can't be paid won't be. But the question is, how aren't you going to pay them? Are you not going to pay them by letting a mass foreclosure movement take place, or are you going to wipe out the bad debts? And that is what led me into archaeology. When I gave a speech in Mexico for the UNITAR, United Nations Institute for Training and Research, in 1979, and I said, Mexico is not going to be able to pay its debts. You're going to have, I'd done 3 articles for UNITAR showing there'd be a third world debt crisis. And I did this for Chase Manhattan Bank when I was analyzing the third world. How much can a foreign country pay? And the idea of figuring how much a foreign country can pay is how much net exports can it make. All of that it earns should be paid as debt service. That's the basic assumption of a bank. It's all up for grabs. And my job is to say how much is up for grabs and how much can we get, and what'll Chase's share be of the overall New York banks and all of this. Well, it turned out there was someone who I suspect was a CIA plant, is the reporter, who who completely misrepresented my thoughts and said something like the Southern Hemisphere will have to work really hard to repay its debts. So I stood up and demanded an apology from the president of Mexico for falsifying everything that I'd said. I said I pulled out the American delegation. I also pulled out the Canadian delegation. I had been a landed immigrant in Canada when I was financial advisor of Canada. And so there was a riot, and they tried to beat up all the Americans, find the Americans, beat them up that night to find me. And it happened, a former girlfriend of mine was part of Massachusetts. There was a Dadaist ballet, and I hit out on the ballet stage, and I was the only guy that wasn't beaten up. But then I realized that it's really important writing a history of what happens when countries haven't paid their debts. And it took me about a year to get back to Rome and Greece. And then there was a blank, and I knew about the Jubilee year in the Bible, but then I found there was a whole mass of material that hadn't been collected from Mesopotamia, and that every ruler of Hammurabi's dynasty started the reign by canceling the debts and they called it a proclamation of order. Well, they didn't, obviously they were speaking Sumerian, not American, and my advantage was that I didn't read Sumerian. I was sort of, enough languages are enough, so I had to read them in German, French, English, and American translations, and every translation was completely different. And it was like a Rorschach test. For every time they'd have a word for their economic policy, the Americans translated it as tax reduction. And the Sumerologist, Samuel Kramer, wrote a letter on the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated saying, Ronald Reagan, do what Rukagina of Sumer didn't. Cancel the taxes so we can be rich. The English called it a free trade act. How English can you get? I mean, the English act was what. The Germans got it better, calling it a debt cancellation, but in enormously complex Professorendeutsch. And the French, of all people, got it right. They called it a restoration of order. And the Sumerian term in 2500 BC was amargi, coming from the root ma, the original to the mother condition. So when Saddam Hussein said this will be the mother of all wars, he meant this is, the primordial war. It was a return to the original state, and the original state in Sumer and Babylonia was exactly, word for word, what you have in the Bible for the Jubilee year. Andurarum in Babylonian was cognate to Hebrew Deror. And you liberated the debt servants, you canceled the debts, and you returned all of the land, the self-support land, but not the townhouses, that had been forfeited to creditors. And it was all returned to order so that you would have a free citizenry able to fight in the army and defend the state and perform the corvée labor instead of letting the creditors take over and divert all this land and wealth for themselves. So I tried to publish this book in 1988, and the university presses sent it out and said, the Economist said this is impossible. You can't have that. You'd have an absolute crisis. Because who would lend money? Well, the government lent all the money, and it's very easy to cancel the debts when most debts were owed to the palace and the temples, and you're canceling debts to yourself. The problem is when you privatize debt and you're canceling debts that are owed to an increasingly rich independent class that you didn't control, that's when they'd overthrow you. And for instance, in Sparta, in the 3rd century BC, kings Aegeus and Cleomenes and then Nabis tried to cancel the debts. The oligarchs all called in Rome and killed them, the leaders, and had the oligarchy. Same thing in Asia Minor in the 1st century BC when Mithridates tried to cancel the debts. The Romans invaded Asia Minor and really took over. So you had the whole war about antiquity. The whole crisis was how do you handle the fact that most debts can't be paid? How do you prevent debt from tearing apart society apart? Well, through my Harvard group, what they did was they said, look, we're going to take each chapter of your book and we're going to have a conference every 2 years and we're going to have the leading Assyriologists and Egyptologists and all come, and they're all going to come. So now the ideas that we've had 5 volumes, the idea have all spread throughout Assyriology, and that's all assumed as normal. The economists have not included any of this. And last year, one of the books of the year, according to the Financial Times, was a silly book by a professor at a Yale professor, Gottsman, who talked about the crisis of 1748 BC. And the crisis was when Larsa, a city right near Rimson of Larsa, canceled the debts just before he went to war with Hammurabi. What this guy didn't realize is that Hammurabi canceled it. He was canceling the debts so that everybody would go to war for him to fight against Babylonia, and Hammurabi also canceled the debts. When he conquered Larsa, he had another debt cancellation. It happened to be a 30th year of rule. You had the rule in antiquity was if you wanted to conquer a city, you'd cancel the debts and promise to free the slaves, and that way the slaves would come over to your side. And if you're attacking the city, you promise to do this. If you were defending the city, you promise to do this. This is what Zedekiah did in the Bible, went back on his word. It's what Coriolanus did in Rome, went back on his word, as Shakespeare wrote in his play. And it's what Obama did in 2008, promising to write down the junk mortgage debts, and Congress actually provided funds for that. None of that was done. He went, as soon as he was elected, he said, well, I'm not really representing the voters, I'm representing my constituency, the campaign contributors. And he invited the campaign contributors to the White House, and he said, I'm the only guy standing between you and the pitchforks. Don't worry, I'll fluff them, and they'll think I'm on their side. And he put all this on the website of the White House, for his meeting, because there's always somebody there writing down what he said. This is actually there. They took it off the next week. I have that also in Killing the Host. So what you've had is the same situation today that you've had in antiquity. And if you don't cancel the debts, if you don't write them down, if you don't shift banking into the public sector, where the public sector can do what it does in China, China will not have a banking crisis because the money's owed to the government. And the government can say, either we can bankrupt industry and sell it all off to the Americans who can create money, or we can write down the debts and keep our industry solvent. That's what they're doing in China. They didn't do it. You see what happened in Greece. You've seen what's happened in Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, where they don't cancel the debts. You're having this polarization. And to me, this is the key economic fight of the time. It also happened to be what Marx wrote about in Volume 3 of Capital, where he talked about the exponential growth of debt. He said debt does not grow as part of the capitalist system. It's external to capitalism. It grows by purely mathematical rules of compound interest, not economic balance rules. And more than anyone else in the 19th century, Marx collected all of the writings that he could on the mathematics of compound interest to show that the financial system was not really part of the capitalist system. It was external to it, and it threatened to crush it. And he said, thank God, the role of the capitalist system is to create public banking and public land ownership. It solved the rentier problem, and by organizing industrial economies more efficiently, paved the way for socialism. It hadn't worked out that way. He was much too optimistic. So that's basically what Matthew.
Thank you. I think there are a few items on the table for questions. So thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Gary.
Who wants to go first?
There.
Jeff.
Yeah. Um, very good, very wide-ranging and erudite presentation, and I appreciated some of the quotes, especially the one from Greenspan about American workers, which shocked me at the time. But let me ask you about this. You used the word collapse several times, and the phrase "it can't continue." But at the same time, over the last 100 years, maybe starting with World War I, as your analysis suggests, we've had debt bubbles, we've had collapses, and the system seems pretty resilient. I've been waiting for the collapse for a long time, and I'm getting older and older. So I guess I have two questions. When you say collapse, do you mean something like 2007, or are we talking about something much larger? And if so, what's the scenario? How would we know that the next one is bigger? And is that and just talk about what you mean by collapse.
You're right. I was using collapse really as a journalistic word. What I really mean is unsustainability. And there's a certain point at which the system can be unsustained, and nothing really collapses, it's transformed. I mean, even when somebody dies, they're transformed into earth and the rest, everything else. So collapse doesn't mean an end of a system, it means a phase change. It means a shift. And the phase change that we're undergoing now is a polarization where large parts of society, both individual families and companies, and entire national economies such as Greece, are pushed below the break-even point. So collapse would be negative equity. It would be operating in a deficit. That at a certain point, the deficit will use up all of the capital or savings that have been accumulated. So a family that loses its job or faces rising rake-offs from its budget for housing or health care will deplete its savings and not have anything else left. And that's why so many families today are not left with enough to sustain themselves in retirement. So you have actually a declining savings for older Americans, especially of racial and ethnic minorities, but also the poorer Americans, have less and less savings left to sustain themselves in retirement, and that what is going to happen to them? Are they going, in Latvia, where I was research director of the Riga Graduate School of Law, in Greece, they're emigrating. And you have whole societies emptying out. But where can the Americans emigrate? I mean, I'm told I have a green card in China, so I can get out, but I don't know what the rest of the economy is going to be able to do. So unsustainability and transformation is a better term. Now, what Marx thought was that this transformation was going to be all upward, and that somehow people were going to do the whole idea of the materialist approach to history is society is going to arrange its economic and tax laws to maximize the means of production most efficiently. But that's not what's happening. And what we're happening now, by collapse, I should say it's a retrogression back to neo-feudalism, back to an epoch where the commanding heights are held by finance and real estate, not by industry and not by the population at large.
And is that not sustainable?
No, it's not sustainable because you don't have enough income for people to live on. You have suicide rates going up. You have you can see what happened in Russia after its privatization in 1991. You can see it happen in Latvia and the post-Soviet economies. The lifespans shortened. The population dropped. President Putin said that more Russians died as a result of neoliberalism than died in World War II. And that was the disaster that he meant when he said the way in which the Soviet Union was dismantled by neoliberalism. So you have a failing of society beyond sustainability rates. And the metaphor for that is what's happening environmentally. But you can look at debt pollution very much like environmental pollution, where the volume of debt expands so much that it eats into in industry, and the governments have to be stripped of their infrastructure, stripped of their public domain in order to pay the debt service. So you have an asset stripping is what I mean. Steve.
Yeah, so I'll give the short question, and I'll expand a little bit. So the short question is, why is Douglas North wrong? And the long thing is, what do I mean by that?
Well, he's wrong in almost everything he
so
says, including antiquity.
Right, so his argument, though, is that the British, in essence, were able to win the Napoleonic Wars because you could finance at a lower interest rate because the government, because you had privatized finance, as opposed to in France, where you had, every 20 years there would be a debt forgiveness, but basically that was then capitalized in the interest rates. So you pay higher interest rates because you knew eventually that the principal was going to be forgiven, so you sort of accounted for that by charging more for the money.
So, just excuse me, I had a previous engagement. Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, his wrongness begins in Mesopotamia. When
I was asking about something you said.
When he talked about, he was given the Nobel Prize for, what was that word he used for overhead? He used a word for intermediation or something.
Something like that.
His basic theory is that governments are unproductive, and if he were wrong, and everything would have, privatization is efficient, Thatcherization is efficient, government enterprise is inefficient, and he had a whole theory of American economic development in the 19th century. Everything he said on that is wrong. Everything about Mesopotamia. Basically, he's a Thatcherite ideologue who said if the government does anything to help the people, that's inefficient. Let them die. Give all the money to Goldman Sachs. They're the productive people. That's why he was given the Nobel Prize. That's what the Nobel Prize is given for. One of the entries I have in junk economics is idiot savant. People like Robert McNamara. People who are very bright, but they didn't know what to be bright about. He'll have a theory that is internally consistent, that everything government does is wasteful and a form of overhead, but it's the exact opposite. If he would have gone back at the beginning of civilization and been the economic advisor, we wouldn't have had civilization. We'd have, early, it never would have taken off. We would have had stagnation. So you have a fictitious, and this is his view is what underlies the national income accounts and the federal budget. The federal budget assumes you're running a deficit because it doesn't give the government credit for any capital formation that it does to build on infrastructure, and it doesn't measure the return of infrastructure, is how it's supporting public services less expensively than a Thatcherite, or now I guess we should say Trumpian, organization of them would work. So it's all based on, junk economics is based on junk statistics, and he's given the economic legitimation for junk statistics.
But he's an institutionalist, so he's not arguing for
No, he's not an
non-existence.
institutionalist. Yeah,
I mean,
nothing
he's-
to, no. He calls, just
I mean,
because
I've-
somebody calls himself an institutionalist, I can assure you, Thorstein
Yeah.
Veblen was an
Yeah.
institutionalist.
Yeah.
Simon Patton was an institutionalist. There has been a capture of the word institutionalism by right-wing Thatcherites. There's a guy in England that basically has sort of got the monopoly on this. With an H, his last name. Forget it. What? Hudson, that's right. He has falsified the history of institutionalism to expurgate the fact that every institutionalist in the 19th century, every commons, everyone who called themselves institutionalists, focused on how do you explain economic rent and rent theory. That rent theory is not something that can be justified technologically. It's not something that can be justified economically. It has to be a carryover from the way in which past privileges have somehow survived in the economic system, and it's the job of our job as institutionalists is to liberate society from this rentier class. Hodgson says, no, institutionalism is about Darwinian, evolutionary development, nothing about economic rent, nothing about Simon Patton, nothing about what you're talking about, Michael. I mean, we've talked about this before.
Well, was North wrong about the French interest rate?
Yeah, so the idea is that if you have to give up
Was he wrong about the French interest rate?
being higher because
In the
you
Napoleonic
you
War.
would give away, because you knew,
Yes,
if I'm
he
a
was-
lender, I know that
He was
you're gonna
completely
have
wrong
to-
about that, and Napoleon recognized that. Napoleon recognized that the problem is that the French had not organized their financial system in a way that the English had. I have a whole chapter on that in my Trade, Development, and Foreign Debt, when there are 3 volumes of Napoleon's Financial Manager. I'm blocking out his name right now, that have been published, and the financial system was not able to monetize the French war spending to the extent that the British system was able to monetize it. And this was all written about in the 1830s, from the 1830s to the 1860s, and none of this appears in North's writing, but it was very popular at the time. And when I was working for Augustus Kelly, reprints of economic classics, we reprinted most of these books to try to get them into the curriculum. And the response of the neoliberals was to drop the history of economic thought from the economic curriculum. So at least when I took my PhD in the 60s, there were still courses in history of economic thought. Now they've been dropped because everything that Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Ricardo and Malthus said is offensive to the neoliberal school, and so I have all these people mentioned in J is for Junk Economics saying, here's what they said, and it's the exact opposite of what they're purported to say by the neoliberals who make them the
So I love this image of how the pyramids got built. That it wasn't slave labor, it wasn't the state applying coercion, cracking the whip, but it was actually the removal of the debt coercion that then allowed people to go
and
to
it was
these
beer parties and a lot of feast,
awesome
a
beer
lot of
parties
meat,
in the desert.
a high meat diet,
Yeah.
a lot of sacrifices of lambs.
And I'm trying to figure out, what are the contemporary analogs? And the only thing that comes to mind in terms of like a removal of debt being connected to public service is I think it's the AmeriCorps Vista program, right, where you enter into a long contract to teach in a public school in an underserved community in order to get student loan debt forgiveness.
Yeah, that's really working off the debt. It's not the
Mhm.
best
Yeah.
example. The best example is the German economic miracle,
Okay.
the German debt cancellation of the Allied monetary reform of 1948. Every internal debt in Germany was canceled up to, except for the debts owed by employers to their workers for whatever wage debt was owed, and a minimum working balance. So you started Germany as a debt-free economy, and that was the economic miracle. And the State Department for 1948 has published, this whole debt cancellation. I think if we do a book on debt cancellation, we should include just what that was. That was the economic miracle. That's what they called free enterprise. And when the classical economists talked about a free economy, they meant an economy free of rent, free of interest, an economy where you were free of unearned income in a rentier class. And now a free economy means an economy free for the rentiers. Exactly the opposite. They've inverted classical economics. So the German economic miracle is the example. It worked. And you don't find this anywhere in Germany. You have a kind of implanted memory in Germany that somehow if the government runs a budget deficit, you end up with a Weimar inflation. And they don't realize that the German deficit, not a penny was created for domestic spending in Germany. It was all spent to throw Reichsmarks onto the foreign exchange market and to pay the reparations to the Allies, who turned around and paid the inter-allied debts to the United States, who kept the interest rates low enough that Wall Street would then loan the money to the German municipalities to convert dollars into Reichsmarks for the circular flow that ended up when the low interest rates caused the stock market boom. I have a whole chapter on this in the my foreign debt book, the Trade, Development, and Foreign Debt.
Yes.
There's an Italian economist, Anthony Graziani, who talks about if the debt burden gets too large, it can only be solved with transfers of real wealth. I think we saw that in 2007, where houses were foreclosed on. So even if we do move towards, even if we do move towards a public banking system, do we also need to couple that with heavy taxation of accumulation and regulation of financial innovation to prevent other forms of debt?
It does have to go with a tax system. Here's the thing: if you don't tax the increase in the land value for real estate, take the Second Avenue subway in New York, just six billion dollars for the subway. That has added increased the real estate value all along Second Avenue and First Avenue by about $12 billion. Now, the city could have recaptured all of this $6 billion and self-financed it by a real estate, a windfall gains tax on real estate. Instead, they raised the subway fares, and they're increasing the sales tax, so that the whole city has to pay just for the landlords gaining along this particular street. And as soon as the subway is built, now the landlords now can borrow from the bank all this increased value. The rents are going up all along Second Avenue and the Upper East Side. And now the buildings you can borrow much more, and all of this increased value is paid to the banks. So if you do not tax back this windfall gains, the landlords will pledge this rent to the banks to pay interest, and the free lunch is going to be paid as interest, not paid to the public sector, which is now forced into debt. So New York will have to issue more bonds to pay, paying yet more money to the public sector. So you have a vicious circle paid by the tax policy that is not congruent with the public banking you want. And the advantage of public banking is it wouldn't make the same kind of loans that commercial banks are making. It wouldn't make corporate takeover loans. It wouldn't make loans for chief financial officers to pay out more of their cash flow as dividends. It wouldn't engage in financial engineering. The financial engineering is almost antithetical to industrial engineering, and that's part of what makes our economy unsustainable today.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Do you have ideas about how to prevent financial innovation, though? Even if we have a public banking system, if there's credit injection into the economy, public money, state money, what's preventing the people who accumulate it from creating their own debt apparatus?
There's always going to be debt. No one in the Bronze Age thought of banning interest rates. What they thought of doing was saying, when the debts grow up beyond the ability to be paid, when there's a crop failure, when there's a drought, we cancel the debts. When families do run into debt, but after a given period, when a new ruler takes the throne, we all begin over again. Obviously, people are going to run into debt. There's nothing wrong with commercial debts. Commercial debts never had to be written off. Nobody asked for commercial debts to be written off. When ships sank at sea, from Babylonian law until Roman law, the debt didn't have to be paid. When a caravan was robbed, the investors, the lenders to the merchants, didn't get paid, so they shared in it. You had a system of laws that kept debt within the ability to be paid, and that's what you don't have today. A public banking system would lend for productive loans, for people to act, not just to buy property that's increasing in price because banks will lend more and more money against the property. They would lend for actual capital formation, for means of production that would employ labor. What do you want to do is rebuild America's employment of labor. You'd have a full employment budget, and you wouldn't lend to the fire sector, you'd lend to what is left of the industrial sector, but it would be definancial. You'd make the kind of lending that would be definancialized. It would be industrial lending, not financial lending.
I just had a question on some of the consequences of the rise of financialization. So you talked about the William Lazonick Harvard Business Review article where you looked at the earnings of the publicly listed S&P 500 companies from 2003 to 2012, and that 54% of the earnings went to stock buybacks. So that's $2.4 trillion. And then the other 37% went to dividends. So
Right.
they're not investing in productive
That's
capacity.
right.
And so I thought it was interesting from looking at some of your writings, which I'm not very familiar with, but that the rise of financialization coincides with the decline in the growth rate of productivity.
Yes.
So productivity growth rates have been
Well,
declining.
but what is
Coincides.
productivity? That's what I wanted to write my dissertation on at NYU in 1968. And the person teaching the productivity course was Solomon Fabricant. Perfect name. He was head of the National Bureau. When I walked into his office, he repeated what he'd said in class. He asked me to join the CIA. And said that if I joined the CIA, I could do wonderful reports, like the report that he had right on his office. And he said, a secret report, but I can show it to you. People who have top secret clearances love to tell the secrets. What's the point of having a secret if you can't tell it to someone? And it was the report of the CIA on Russia's gold producing capacity, and hence its ability to pay its foreign debt. So Russia doesn't have any gold because they're all sitting there like in the 49ers in San Francisco, panning gold in the river, and there's just not that much gold in the rivers anymore, and it ices over in summer, and the kids can't do it. Well, as it happened, since I was the balance of payments economist for Chase at the time, our main client in the copper industry was Anaconda. And Anaconda had wondered where Russia was getting its gold. So it had bought gold bars from the Russian central bank that it had to sell to pay the debt. And it had done an analysis, and it found that all of this gold in the bars was electrolytic gold. That is, it was a byproduct of refining copper. And Russia had a huge electrification program. They had huge copper mines, and as about 3% of the value of Chilean copper, for instance, is when the copper ore, you put it in a solution and it sticks to the anode. The copper and the silver and the platinum, the other metals that are found with copper, fall to the bottom. And that was where Russia got its gold, as a byproduct of the copper that it needed for its electrification and construction projects. And I said that, and he got red in the face and said, well, why do you want to write about productivity? We don't have that. The concept of productive and unproductive labor, we don't have it anymore because economics is an ascending line. And if we've rejected an idea, it's because it didn't survive in Darwin's struggle for existence. And we have a struggle for existence within economies. And we don't hold that anymore. Why would you want to find an obsolete concept that's lost the struggle for existence? So needless to say, I did not write my dissertation under him. I found a friendly Marxist business professor that let me write about American protectionists in the 19th century, something. It was on Erasmus Peshine Smith, who none of you ever heard of, that was uncontroversial enough to get me by the PhD committee.
Thank you very much, Michael. And on that, maybe I can ask everyone to join me and just thank you, Michael, for this whistle-stop tour through Staffington. We're excited to be working with him, and perhaps if you want to get your book signed, he wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes to do that.